succession next, so make sure you have your note sheets and you're ready to go. Ecological succession is the process of ecological change in an ecosystem when you've got one community being replaced by another community over time. And succession can happen in two ways. One, the formation of a brand new ecosystem, and we'll talk about cases where that would happen. Or secondary succession, this would be the recovery of an old ecosystem. So maybe one damaged by a natural disaster of some kind, recovering from that. Primary succession, again, this is where there was no community there before, and now you're going to have a new ecosystem form in that place. So the example on the slides, you have a new volcanic island. So you get a volcano that erupts somewhere in the middle of the ocean, brand new island, never had life on it before. And then over time, primary succession would occur until you have an ecosystem there. So things like exposed rock, maybe the rock wasn't exposed before, something happens, it becomes exposed, like maybe a glacier sweeps through and scrapes out a new rock surface, lava, melted ice, eroded sand, things like that would result in an area where primary succession could occur. Primary succession occurs over a long period of time. This is a very long, slow process. And the first species that are going to move into this brand new environment are called the pioneer species. So the first organisms to grow in a new environment. When you're talking about primary succession, this is going to be things like lichen and moss, or lichen, however you say it. So you can see in the pictures, some pictures of lichen up top, and then on the bottom on the tree, that's also lichen, a little less zoomed in, and then moss on those rocks by the waterfall. These organisms, what's unique about them is that they can grow in areas where others cannot. So they can grow on top of, for example, rocks or sand or something like that, where other organisms can't do that. And over time, these organisms are going to decompose, so that they'll die, their parts of them will decompose, and new ones will come, and then they'll die and decompose. And as that happens, they're going to release nutrients and the leftover bits of their decomposed selves to create a layer of soil that's eventually going to allow larger and more complex plants to be able to grow in. Once enough soil has been generated in order to keep those nutrients around, because, for example, if you just have loose rocks or sand or something, then nutrients are going to tend to just filter down into the ground, go into underground water sources, and be washed away. But once you've got enough soil to be able to start holding on to some of those nutrients, you're going to get small plants, some small flowers, ferns and shrubs, things like that are going to begin to grow. So not big things like trees yet, but some of those smaller plants and shrubs will be able to fill in. Then those plants are going to further break down that rock, creating more soil that will be able to stay in that area. So the more soil you have on top of those rocks, the less that the soil and the nutrients are going to get washed away with it. Then the seeds from other plants, and now finally we're talking about even potentially trees, will become able to grow, and over time larger plants will be able to inhabit that area. And again, we're talking about very long periods of time. As new species of plants move in, then animals are going to be able to inhabit the area as well, because they're going to have trees for shelter, shade, places to live, plants to eat if you're talking about the herbivores, so those primary consumers. And organisms growing in each stage may even hinder their own survival but pave the way for future organisms. So as they're making that environment more rich and more hospitable to larger plants, that's certainly if you're a lichen or a moss growing on the ground, or if you're a small shrub or a bush, then a large tree comes over and takes the sun light from prevents the sunlight from being able to reach you. Things like that might hinder your own survival, but it is going to help the ecosystem grow and develop and add more organisms in the future. And then eventually a mature community is going to result. And then once that happens, that mature community is going to be, sorry if you hear my dog groaning. The mature community is going to be stable, and you're going to have little change in the composition of species. So again, doesn't mean things don't change at all, but they tend to have natural ebb and flow. And that when we have that mature, stable community of plants and animals, that's called the climax community. So that's ultimately what the ecosystem is able to support in a stable fashion. And so then primary succession would be done. And so again, this is reached towards the end of succession. Because once you've got that climax community, there's no need for the ecosystem to regularly be turning over in terms of what species live there. Okay, secondary succession is a little bit different. This occurs in an area where there previously were organisms living. So there was a stable ecosystem or reasonably stable ecosystem already, but then there was some kind of disturbance that happened. And so in the picture, you see a forest fire, but also farming. So if humans come in, cut down or knock down a previously existing ecosystem, and then say the humans abandon that farmland, go away, it could go through secondary succession. A hurricane, things like that. So weather events that, unlike, say, a volcano, where it's completely devastating to an area or creates completely new land, you're killing a lot of the living things in that area, but not perhaps everything. And part of the key thing with secondary succession is even if you were to destroy absolutely all of the living things in that area, the soil is going to remain intact. So it's going to take less time than primary succession because you don't have to start back at the stage of lichens and moss growing on rocks, creating those first little bits of soil. You've already got that soil. And so when you're doing secondary succession, the pioneer species in this case would be weeds and grasses. So you're already starting at the stage of plants, just smaller plants, not all the way to shrubs and trees yet, but bigger than lichens and mosses. And this process typically begins with weeds and grasses that are able to grow quickly and proceeds again until a climax community is reached. So it's still that same endpoint, but again, because you have the soil intact, this is the community is going to be able to reestablish itself or establish a new community quickly. Okay, so that's really the end of the notes. You've got 3 think about it questions on the last page of your notes. So pause the video, take a minute, read those questions to yourself, see if you can answer them either in your head or write out a loose answer. And then when you're ready, push play and I'll go over this again. Okay, so I'm assuming you paused. The first question is, where in succession would you expect to find organisms and stages that last for short periods of time? And then second question is, where would you expect to find organisms and stages that last for long periods of time? And so short periods of time would happen at the beginning and then long at the end. So you're going to get these short periods of time at the beginning when the lichens and mosses and things like that are able to turn things back around, especially in secondary succession when you're already starting with weeds and grasses, being able to start reestablishing the things that the community needs. But then as you move towards the end, think about things like trees that take a really long time to grow. And so if you've got to get mature trees growing before a lot of the, say, animal species start returning to the ecosystem, stuff like that, those stages are going to take a long time. Next question, why might secondary succession tend to occur more quickly than primary? I think this question's a little bit easier because I talked about it more directly, and that's because you don't have to make soil from scratch in secondary succession the way you do in primary. Even if the soil may have taken some damage as part of the disaster, you still have at least most of the soil still intact, or maybe even all. Whereas in primary, you don't have any soil to begin with. You've maybe got sand or rocks or something like that. Okay, then third question, what kind of organism would you expect to find in an area where disturbances are frequent or intense? So this would be an area where maybe the ecosystem either doesn't make it all the way to a climax community before the next disturbance comes along, or maybe it makes it, but it doesn't spend a long period of time there before it gets disturbed again. And so in this case, you would tend to see a lot of lichens and mosses and short grass because you would often be reset to those earlier stages of ecological succession. Okay. There it is. Okay. Sorry, my slides wouldn't advance. So this is a summary table. Again, I think pausing the video, trying to put some of this together on your own will be helpful. And then you can push play, fill in your gaps, and adjust as needed. So primary succession, remember we're building a brand new ecosystem from scratch, no soil to start with. So you have to build everything from soil on up. And an analogy in this case, and if your analogy is different, it doesn't mean that yours is bad. This is just an analogy that I have. When you're thinking about primary succession, this would be like baking cookies or baking a cake or something all the way from scratch. You're starting with the flour, the butter, the sugar, all of that. You're not starting from, say, a mix. And an example of primary succession would be something like a volcano erupts or a glacier melts, and so brand new ground is being exposed. And the pioneer species in this case would be mosses and lichens, because they're the ones that can, one, live in these really inhospitable places, but then also they can make the soil. And then the result would be that mature and stable climax community. For secondary succession, the definition, now we're not building a new ecosystem, we're recovering a previous existing ecosystem after some kind of a disturbance happened, and the soil is already intact in this case. And the analogy here would be baking cookies with pre-made dough. So you go to the store and you buy dough and you're just putting it onto your cookie sheet and baking them. You're starting part way through the process. And so examples, things like forest fires, hurricanes, farming, stuff like that. Tsunami would be another one. I don't know, anything where you're still going to be able to have that soil intact. And then pioneer species here, weeds and grasses. It doesn't mean that you might not have some mosses and lichens, because they, again, do grow in really inhospitable places. But because the soil is there, you can also have the weeds and grasses at this stage. You don't need to wait for the lichens and mosses to make the soil first. And then same result as the primary succession. So notice there are differences along the way, but regardless of whether you're doing primary or secondary succession, the end result is the same. It's that mature and stable climax community. Okay, and that's it for the notes. Again, if this went too fast for you, then these slides will be on Canvas. You can go back, take a look, fill in your gaps, get your notes done there.